Welcome to Nobody Told Me. I'm Laura Owens.
I'm Jan Black. On this episode, we welcome Andrew Tarvin, who calls himself the world's first humor engineer, teaching people how to get better results while having more fun. Andrew is the author of several books on humor, including The United States of Laughter, One Comedian's Journey Through All 50 States, and Humor That Works, 501 Ways to Use Humor to Beat Stress, Increase Productivity, and Have Fun at Work.
Andrew, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So you're the world's first humor engineer. I'm curious to know what exactly that is and what companies hire you to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that I think about a humor engineer is I got a degree in computer science and engineering from Ohio State. And if you think about a computer science engineer, they help solve various problems and challenges using computers, programming, et cetera. A mechanical engineer does the same thing, but with more mechanical things, et cetera. So a humor engineer is someone who solves problems using humor. So companies hire me to work with them on things like creating a more positive workplace culture or improving employee engagement or working with individual employees so that they can manage their stress a little bit better or enjoy their work a little bit more, all with the ultimate goal of being more effective in the workplace.
And how did you develop your humor?
Well, I've always had a little bit of elements of humor. I remember growing up reading Calvin and Hobbes and The Far Side. I'd always pick up a newspaper and skip the sports section and all that and always go to the comics. So I think I've always appreciated humor, but I didn't really start using humor myself until college when my best friend in college at Ohio State wanted to start an improv comedy group. He needed people and kind of forced me to join. And so we started that way. We watched Whose Line Is It Anyway and tried to repeat what we saw.
So at what point did you realize that you personally were really funny and had a way of connecting with people?
I think that it wasn't actually until I started doing stand-up. So we had done improv for about a year. And then at Ohio State, there's a stand-up comedy competition. And a bunch of us in the improv group were like, oh, well, if we do this, if we can make this up, if we can be funny while we're making things up off the top of our head, it's got to be easier when you write it down. And it turns out it's much harder. At least for me, stand-up is a lot harder than improv. But the first time I did stand-up, when I was standing alone on a stage and got my first laugh, that was the first time where I was like, oh, okay, it's not just my friends that are funny. It's not just these circumstances that are funny, but no, I have this ability to kind of make this work. And of course, my first set was not very good, but I got enough laughs to kind of say, oh, okay, well, let me try it again. And then with a lot of practice and repetition, a lot of open mics, etc., started to learn the skills and the tools that comedians use to be funny.
And how did you decide that this was information that would translate to the workplace?
Well, it kind of happened by accident. So after I graduated from Ohio State, I started working as a project manager at Procter & Gamble. And I remember being in a meeting, and maybe people can identify with this, where you're like incredibly bored in the meeting. And you kind of like wish that you were just about anywhere else. And I was experiencing that, but the problem was that I was the one leading the meeting.
Uh-oh.
And so I was like, if I'm bored while I'm talking, they've got to be bored listening. And so I started to incorporate humor in the workplace, just really for myself, just to make the process a little bit more enjoyable. And over time, I started to realize that people were really kind of connecting with it. They were coming, they're more eager to come to my meetings, so they knew they're going to have a little bit of fun. Or I used to incorporate jokes at the end of all my emails, and people started to respond back, and they would say things like, oh, this was a good joke, or more often, hey, this was a bad joke, because I love, puns and wordplay.
Right,
but
right.
what it told me was that, what it told me, though, is that the audience was actually reading my emails. And so it kind of started that way internally at P&G.
So how can you use comedy in the workplace but not be labeled a clown or the funny guy or just a jokester?
Yeah, it's a common kind of concern that people have. And I think that there's a couple of things to keep in mind when using humor in the workplace. The first kind of high-level idea is that humor is a how. It's not like what you do. It doesn't replace what you do. It just changes how you do things. So, for example, one of the things that I share is like humor is kind of like the salt of a meal. And, the metaphor that I use is that you wouldn't eat an entire meal of salt because that would make you a horse. And do you want to be a horse? I say nay. And that's the cheesiest joke in my presentation, which is why I love it so much, because it causes audiences to groan and everything. But the sentiment is still there, where basically, one, you don't want it to use it as an excuse not to do the work. Where if someone asks you, "Hey, where is this report?" You make a joke, and then like, "No, seriously, where's this report?" And then you'd be like, "All right, well, see you later." You just
Right.
actually do your work. It's more about changing how you do it. The second thing that helps is something that I use and that I train is what's called the humor map. And the humor map stands for your medium, audience, and purpose. So medium being, how are you going to execute the humor? Is it in a conversation or is it an email? Audience is who's going to receive that humor. Is it like a coworker that you know very well? Is it a client that you've just met? Right, because your relationship is going to dictate some of the humor that you might use, as well as what they know is going to change kind of the humor that you use. And then the most important one for me as an engineer is the purpose. Why are you going to use humor? So, humor is incredibly beneficial. There's 30 plus business benefits to using humor in the workplace, backed by research, case studies, and real world examples that rather than just saying, well, I just want to use humor to have more fun, you can be like, well, I want to use humor in this instance to get people to pay attention, or I want to use a story here so that I build rapport with this person that I've just met, or I'm going to use some type of gamification while I'm going through email so that it makes it more fun and I'm more willing to do it for a little bit longer, et cetera. So having that idea of the map, when you can connect it to a specific kind of business purpose, and I think people start to realize, oh, it's not about being a clown, it's about being effective with humans.
Now, in today's work world, we deal with people all around the country and all around the world. And you journeyed through 50 states to find out how humor differed in those states and that kind of thing. What advice would you have for people who are in a work situation where they email or talk on the phone to people in other parts of the country, and maybe the humor is a little bit different?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to that kind of key piece of understanding your audience. And the more you get to know someone, the more specific your humor certainly can be. But I think as you're starting to build relationships with people, and before you know their full sense of humor, one of the things to keep in mind is to use positive and inclusive humor. Think about things that are more positive or jovial rather than thinking about sarcasm or satire. I think that sometimes we jump to sarcasm very quickly in the U.S., and especially over things like email or text, it can be hard to read. It's sometimes, that joke of like, wait, you sent me a response and you used a period instead of an exclamation point. Does that mean that you're mad at me?
Right,
Yeah.
right. No, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, and so I think if you think positive, think like Ellen DeGeneres, like that kind of like general overall style. It's a style called affiliative humor. That's a good place to start. Things like, wholesome memes or funny GIFs in your email or links to talks, that kind of thing. Those are all things that are pretty safe to start with. And then again, as you build a relationship with someone, you'll get a better idea of what their sense of humor is.
What's the first thing that you do when you go into a company?
The first thing that I do is, certainly like say hello to everyone. Usually I have to go to the bathroom every now and then. But the actual real answer is the first thing is to really understand what they're focused on. Again, because humor is a how, because it's a solution to a lot of problems, it's important for me as an engineer to understand what are the biggest challenges that people are facing. So, if I'm speaking in front of a group of people, is it they're all worried about stress management because of all this change that's been happening, and so they're looking for strategies to manage their stress a little bit better? Or are they all newer employees, new hires, and they're looking for ways to make sure that they capture attention of the people around them and lead people that don't report to them, but they still have to get their buy-in for something? Really kind of understanding what their challenges are, and then allowing us that gives us time to then kind of speak to what are the ways that humor can be used to solve those problems. Because, that's what I love about it. That's why I'm a humor engineer. That's why engineer still is my job title, is that to me, I'm passionate about it because it is effective.
You mentioned earlier that you help individuals manage stress at companies. And I'm curious to know what kind of an approach you take when it's just one person. If the company's saying to you hey, this person seems stressed out, they need a laugh in their life. What do you do?
Yeah, well, I think that one of my big tenets of my program, and I'm curious. I'm curious of your response to this, your thoughts on this. So, tell me if you agree or disagree with this statement that you are responsible for your own happiness.
I agree with that.
Agree, right? I think that's true. I don't think that you can necessarily always control your happiness. Like certain things are going to happen. I don't think, and obviously there's things to think about when it comes to mental health and that kind of thing. But I think overall you are responsible for your own happiness. And so one of the things that I try to do is look to empower individuals that no matter what your work circumstance is, no one can control how you think. No one can prevent you from, one of the things that I do is if I'm getting bored when I'm going through emails, I'll start to read each of the emails as a different accent in my head. And it's just something fun to do. And no one can stop me from doing that. Like no boss can come up to me and be like, hey, stop reading emails in an accent in your head.
Right.
No one else can prevent me from listening to a comedy podcast on my way home from work so I show up more present for my family when I get there. Mm-hmm. Right. There's certain things that you do. So part of it is about empowering the individual. And then from there, there's just different strategies kind of around specifically stress management. So a big one is something called strategic disengagement or strategic renewal, which is just basically a fancy corporate word of take a break.
Interesting. What are the do's and don'ts in terms of political humor in the workplace or just in general these days?
Political humor is tough. So if you think about when it comes to humor, I don't think anyone's ever been fired because of a bad joke, but I do think that people have been fired because of an inappropriate joke.
Yeah.
Right. So like a bad joke is like, I once had to miss class because I was, once had to miss class because because I had a hypothermia. I was too cool for school.
Uh-huh.
Right.
I actually kind of like that one, but that's my sense of humor.
It's kind of a groan-worthy joke, right?
Right.
You're not going to get fired because of a joke like that, but you will get fired because of an inappropriate joke. And a joke is typically inappropriate for one of three reasons. The first reason is that it has an inappropriate subject. So just because you're making a joke about something doesn't mean that it's appropriate to talk about in the workplace, right? So if you want to talk about it normally, then just adding a little bit of joke to it doesn't necessarily mean that it's appropriate. And I would say that politics sometimes falls into that, right? Depending on your stance and specifically what it is that you are talking about. The second reason why humor can be inappropriate is that it has an inappropriate target. And so if you think about negative forms of humor, they typically have a target. So there could be a form of self-defeating humor, self-deprecating humor, and that's a negative form of humor where you're making fun of yourself. And that can actually be a good style of humor if used sparingly and if used when in a high status position. So if you are the CEO, if you're someone leading a meeting, if you're seen as kind of higher status, then using self-defeating humor. So things like, for me, I talk about how I'm a pretty skinny person. Have been, like some people have called me frail in the past. And I joke that, I was born 8.3 pounds and then I stayed that way till I was 15 years old. And just making jokes of it, but kind of basically saying, hey, I don't take myself too seriously. And we can kind of laugh about these things. So that's good when in a high status position. It is one that you don't want to use too often, because if you do it too often, then people start to think that you have low self-esteem or that you're unsure of yourself or that you're throwing a pity party. But that's the negative target, right? And it's yourself. It also is negative humor or aggressive humor where the target is someone else. And so you don't want to necessarily do something that is targeting, say, your boss or something like that in a negative way using humor, because it doesn't really solve anything. It doesn't really fix any problems. And then the third reason the third way that humor can be inappropriate is that it comes at an inappropriate time. So if something very stressful happens, or if you just announced layoffs, it's not the time as a CEO to start joking about how big your yacht's going to be.
Exactly.
Right? So it comes at an inappropriate time.
Yeah.
So as long as you kind of avoid those things, typically you can use humor in a more kind of appropriate way. And I would say that politics falls into sometimes the inappropriate target, sometimes the inappropriate subject.
I'm curious to know how humor increases the bottom line for the companies that hire you.
Yeah, so there are working on a post right now, which is the 10 business benefits of when organizations have humor as a part of their culture. Because a lot of my work so far has been on the 30 plus benefits for individuals. So as individuals, you see an increase in productivity, you see a decrease in stress, you see, you get people to pay attention longer, et cetera. But as an organization, when an entire organization does it, there are studies out there that are showing that it leads to an increase in employee engagement, leads to a decrease in turnover, It leads to increase in overall workplace satisfaction. And ultimately, it leads to an increase in profit, because if you think about those individual things, if your workforce is less stressed and the healthcare costs are lower, then that's a net positive. If the employees are more engaged and are actually more productive, net positive. If you reduce turnover, right? They in one study they found that about 31% of people leave their company because of their manager. Like, they might like the company and they might like their work, but they leave because they don't like their manager. In a different study, it found that people who rated their manager's sense of humor as above average, they were less likely to look for a job over the next year. So if you think about incorporating this type of thing where you improve managers' ability to use humor and incorporate it as part of the culture, and you're reducing turnover, then that's an overall going to lead to an increase in profit because you're decreasing the costs associated with it.
How has acceptable humor in the workplace changed? I mean, from a Me Too standpoint, it has changed over the years, especially in recent years.
Yeah, and I think it has changed, and I think certainly for the better, and in the sense that people have been willing to speak up a little bit more. And it kind of goes back to people in the past maybe got away with a little bit of the inappropriate subject or inappropriate target type humor. And now people are just becoming a little bit more aware of it. And again, this is where it goes back to people want positive and inclusive, right? Because certainly the jokes that you're going to have with your friends are going to be very different than the jokes that you're going to have in the workplace. Like, for example, a bunch of my college friends, they're the type, where it's like we would make fun of each other a lot. And if we didn't make fun of you, that meant that we didn't like you at all. And that's a different dynamic than what you potentially want to create with your coworkers, especially when you're first kind of meeting them. So I think it certainly has changed, and in a good way, for people to be able to recognize that, yeah, you can't, just saying, oh, it was just a joke isn't a good excuse, right? You still have to be, responsible for what happened.
I'm curious to know what questions you can ask people to get them to open up to you. Like, how do you lighten the mood in a meeting if it's supposed to be a serious meeting, but you want to make a connection with these people and make them feel like you're another human? What do you do?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that you can do. I think one, starting with the story. So, for example, in my TEDx talk on the skill of humor, I start with the story about my grandmother texting me.
Oh, that was great. You caught me from the start from that.
Thank you. Yeah. So one, it gets you to pay attention a little bit more because it's not your normal boring opening. Two, it is something that is is relatable, right? A lot of people, whether it's themselves or their parents or their grandparents being on, using new technology and having some of the challenges with it. So you're paying attention. But then the key to using humor is, again, it should be connected. So in my TEDx talk, it builds to a punchline, and then that punchline is kind of the thesis of my talk. And that's what you want to do in that type of meeting setting, because I think sometimes we have those experiences where, a senior leader gets up and they tell a story that they clearly picked from like a joke book, and it's moderately okay, funny. And then the remaining 59 minutes of the meeting are, terribly boring and dry. And it never once relates back to the story that they started with. Instead, it's better to start with some type of story that has at least a loose connection to what you're talking about. And you're opening up to the people to say, oh, yeah, it's something that you can do as a reminder. Like if you're talking about your kids, oh, yeah, this person is a human and they have kids as well. Even though I see him or her as a manager, it's reminding me that they are, in fact, a human being with, human emotions and that kind of thing. So I think one of the things that is interesting is that we label people as resources, right? Like as a project manager, I had resources, just as I had like computers, just as I had money for certain projects, right? We had humans that were resources. Right. And I think sometimes that when we label people as resources, that we forget that the person on the other side of an email or the other side of a phone call or the other side of a conference desk is a fellow human being. Mm-hmm. Right, with like human lives and human emotions. And maybe the reason why they got that email to you late isn't because they secretly hate you, but because they have a sick kid at home.
Yeah.
And when we can use humor to humanize the workforce, to remind us that we are humans, that we do have emotions, I think that's where we tend to see a lot better results. And this is one of the things that is, as an engineer, I'm obsessed with efficiency. Right. I want to do things as efficiently as possible. I think the word efficient should be a one syllable. Right. So I'm
I feel like that's a good one.
And
That's a good one.
I feel like it's good, right? I listen to a lot of podcasts on 1.5 speed because it's faster,
Yeah.
and because then people start to sound more like me. They have a nasally voice. But you can't be efficient with humans, right? Because they have emotions, and so instead we have to be effective. And so part of the training is around humor being one of those tools to be effective.
What advice do you have for teachers on using humor in the classroom?
I would say definitely do it. So my brother is a professor at Texas A&M, and he uses a lot of humor in his classrooms, particularly for courses like public speaking, where people are incredibly nervous to get up in front of each other. And he's teaching a new course now on the rhetoric of humor. And he speaks on using humor in the classroom as well. And it does a lot of things. There's studies about how it reduces students' anxieties for tests when humor is involved. It helps to build group relationships in the classroom. It helps people remember things longer. So there's a lot of benefits to it. And I think there's a couple of, starting ways to do it. I think interactive activities is certainly a way. Part of my programs they use applied improvisation. So taking exercises and ideas from the world of improv and applying them to the coursework. So my brother does that as well. So he teaches some basic public speaking skills using improv exercises. Because then when you're doing those improv exercises, it's more about having fun, and then you happen to be practicing the skills that you're talking about, and you're getting to know the people kind of next to you. So I think that's a way. I think that images, more visuals, can be a great way to train people, to educate people in a way that's more interesting. And then also association. I think if you can connect the topic that you're talking about or that you're teaching to something that's more interesting or that the audience is on board with, then they're going to like it. So like my brother, when he teaches the history of rhetoric and the history of Western thought, he will make relations to like the Lion King. And so he'll talk about various, old philosophers and how they relate to the Lion King. And so his audience, his students, remember the Lion King and they know it now. Oh, okay. So Scar is kind of like this person, or Simba is kind of like this person. And so now they're more engaged because it's connecting to something that they care about.
I've heard so many people say that taking an improv class was one of the best decisions of their lives. And I have friends who've taken them and just say that they really look forward to doing it. And it's just helped a lot of aspects of their lives. Why do you think that everyday people should consider taking them, even if they're not what they would consider to be a comedian?
I think that is a great question, and that is a great point. Because I think there's two things that if I had any type of insight or input into our educational process, it would be that every student takes a programming class and every student takes an improv class. Mm-hmm. Because programming teaches you problem solving and kind of resource allocation and leveraging kind of things that already exist. And then improv teaches you human skills for sure. There's a great book by a woman named Patricia Ryan Matson. She was a professor at Stanford for a number of years, started their improv program there, where a number of undergrad students at Stanford take this improv class, and it's called Improv Wisdom. And it's basically a whole list of incredible things that you can learn from taking an improv class. Simple things from being more present in the moment and actually paying attention to kind of what's going on around you, building your skill at being able to think quicker on your feet and react a little bit faster, to building relationships. The fundamental mindset of improvisation is called sand. And you can apply yes and to a lot of different aspects, whether it's improving your brainstorming skills, but then also improving your relationships. If you think about, Stephen Covey says that you want to seek first to understand, then to be understood. Improv helps teach you that skill. Or there's research that was done at Google called Project Aristotle, and they found that the most important attribute for an effective team was that the team had something called psychological safety. And psychological safety is defined as two things. One, that you feel like you can be your authentic self, that you don't put on like a work face. And that two, that if you make a mistake or mess up, that you won't be made fun of or reprimanded for it. And practicing yes and in an improv context starts to build that skill. And when you have yes and kind of as a mindset, that creates psychological safety within a group.
Who do you admire in terms of their ability to use humor, whether it's a politician, a comedian? I'm curious as to who you really think uses humor well.
Yeah, I think there's a number of people that I definitely admire and follow. So my favorite comedian is Eddie Izzard. He's a British comedian, but he has some of my favorite bits, like the Death Star Canteen or Cake or Death. Phenomenal bits worth YouTubing. He's very, very funny, a fantastic storyteller, very imaginative, really explores this comedic idea of if this is true, what else is true, does that very well. So from a comedian's perspective, I really, really like that. Also, the new Netflix special, I guess newish Netflix special called Nanette by Hannah Gadsby is very, very good, and it's a great use of using humor to talk about more serious subjects. The first 15 to 20 minutes of it, you're like, all right, this is fine, but then she gets into some deeper stuff, and it's incredibly impressive how she weaves things in and out. Certainly, there's a lot of great stories about Abraham Lincoln and his use of humor and how he was able to use it in tough times. I think regardless of your political leanings, Obama was very good at the humor that he used, and they were very, he had specific speech writers that would help him with those types of things. So I think anyone that is able to use it and give a message with it. And so Ellen DeGeneres might be my favorite because she is so positive and inclusive in everything that she does that it's inspiring. And I can't remember who said it, but there's a great quote out there that says that at the end of laughter is the height of listening. And so I appreciate the people that once you get people listening because they've been laughing, you do something positive with that attention. That's what I appreciate.
Andrew, you didn't go into your professional career thinking that you were going to become the world's first humor engineer. And I'm wondering how your purpose has evolved over time and what lessons that might teach other people, our audience who's listening, who are trying to figure out their own purpose.
Yeah, I think, I got fortunate in the sense that I discovered it pretty early on. But I think the discovering process, maybe, I don't know if discovering is even the right word, because I searched for it. Once I started working at P&G, I enjoyed the work. But I was like, I don't know that I want to do this forever. And so I experimented. I tried a bunch of different things. And they were all kind of loosely connected to comedy in some way. So I did stand up on the road and did weekends while I was still working at P&G. I would do kind of the club weekends and realized I didn't want to be in a new city every single weekend with people that I didn't know. And then I wrote some sketches for a sketch TV show on cable channel TV, like channel 9,000 or whatever, very small TV show, but then realized that, I didn't like that. I didn't like giving up creative control. I tried, me and some friends put together or created our own short film. And I did the editing and a little bit of writing for it and realized, no, that wasn't quite it. And the one thing that kept on coming back, the one thing that I really enjoyed, stand-up and improv were fun, but what I loved about speaking was that it was stand-up with a message. It was, I could make people laugh, and then I could also help them to be more effective. And so I think for people out there is to try a bunch of stuff. You get to experiment, and you get to, take classes and things to be like, oh, well, I like this. Take an improv class and see what you think about it. Take go and do one of those paint with wine nights to see if you want to do something maybe a little bit more artistic. Try, do various courses at say a General Assembly or other workshop places that you can go to, go to meetups. Just try a bunch of different things and start to see what sticks. And that's where you start to find, what you become passionate about, and then start to explore ways that you can combine that passion with, say, potentially a career if you want to turn it into a career, or maybe you just want to create it as a hobby. But a bunch of stuff, I guess, is my main advice.
Andrew, our show is called Nobody Told Me, and we always ask our guests, what's your Nobody Told Me lesson? So what have you learned along this journey with comedy and humor, laughter, that nobody could have told you about before?
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting is that most people assume that they can't use humor in the workplace. And for whatever reason, I always assumed that I could. And so I think the nobody told me not to use humor. And I was fortunate that no one told me not to, because I started doing it. And as I started to do it, I started to realize that there were incredible benefits to it. And so I think sometimes people are waiting for someone to tell them to do it. And that's part of what I do. I'm the closest person to someone that's going to say, hey, start using humor in the workplace. Most of the time, leaders aren't going to say it. Your mentors aren't necessarily going to say it, but it is something that, again, if you own, or if you're responsible for your own happiness, that you own. to do. So no one told me that I couldn't. And that's probably been one of the biggest differences is that I was like, all right, well, then let's go and see what happens. And it's been a fun journey.
Andrew, how can people connect with you on social media?
So I am Drew Tarvin, DREWTAR, V as in Victor, IN on all the social media that is, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, I think are the ones I'm on. I'm not super on Snapchat or wasn't like Vive or something. Wasn't there one called Vive for a little bit? I don't know that it's real
Vine?
anymore, but
you're not there.
Right.
It was another one that came and went, so it's not that. But yeah, Drew Tarvin for any of those, or they can check out if they want to learn more about specifically humor in the workplace. We have some great resources on our site, humorthatworks.com. So you can sign up for a weekly newsletter where we give tips. There's also the 30 benefits of humor. So if you need to try to make the case, the business case, you can do that. There's also plenty of free resources on some example ways to get started, some more information about the humor map, the different styles of humor, some of the things that we talked about. Plenty of resources there because my goal is to help more and more people use humor in the workplace. So I try to help people in whatever way I can.
And Andrew, we thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I had a great time.
Our thanks to Andrew Tarvin, the author of several books on humor, including The United States of Laughter and 501 Ways to Use Humor to Beat Stress, Increase Productivity, and Have Fun at Work. Again, you can learn more about him at humorthatworks.com and andrewtarvin.com. I'm Jan Black.
And I'm Laura Owens.
You're listening to Nobody Told Me. Thank you for joining us.